see all of you. Thank you for that very warm introduction. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. I love the name, the Gumbo of ability, the idea that many people coming together, diversity, can lead to better outcomes and really is the strength of our country. So it's an honor to be here today to speak at this wonderful conference. I got to know OutSolve when I was OFCCP Director because so many of our contractors used OutSolve for their affirmative action programs. And I've seen now in private practice at K&L Gates how many of you use OutSolve as well. And I actually work with OutSolve quite often for my clients. And what a wonderful product. One thing about OutSolve that's incredible, and I don't recommend it, but it is incredible, is that they can put together an affirmative action program in 24 hours. I mean, it's something where if you really have an emergency, maybe a company that hasn't realized it's a federal contractor or one that you don't think is a federal contractor, but you have to produce something to OFCCP, they can be right there for you. I've always been really impressed with that. So it's a real honor to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. I'm speaking about a topic that is more important to me than any other, disability inclusion, accessibility, and I'll tell you a little bit as to why that's so important to me during this presentation today. But I remember for me, one of the highlights of my career was when I was OFCCP Director. That probably was the highlight of my career, I'd say. And, but I remember going to the NILG conference, and I know many of you go to that conference, and I remember my first one in Anaheim when I had just been named OFCCP Director, and I spoke to an audience of 1,000 people for the first time, and I remember how exciting that was. And to have a dynamic, at least I hoped it was dynamic, exciting, active sort of approach to OFCCP with all these ideas, getting to engage with the contractor community, that was a very meaningful moment to me. And then the year later, in Milwaukee, when I started my NILG keynote address, and I said, the first thing I want to mention in this keynote address is disability. Because I think for so long it's always been mentioned last. It's always been mentioned last. And I want to talk about it first this time. I want to tell you how that's going to be the focus of this entire year at OFCCP, through the Section 503 focused reviews and through all the compliance assistance you're going to see from us and all the focus on it, and really bringing disability inclusion and accessibility to the fore. And I said, that doesn't mean we're going to stop looking at race and gender discrimination and other forms of discrimination. Those continue to occur and they need to be a focus. Racism and sexism in employment is odious, it's wrong, it needs to be stopped, it's bad for this country. It's bad for employees, it's bad for employers, but so is ableism. Ableism is as bad, and it's something that needs to be focused on just as much. I remember saying that, and I got such a response from the audience. It was as if the HR professionals, attorneys, leaders in the audience were agreeing with me. I felt that, yeah, maybe we do need to focus on disability more. And not at the expense of the other protected classes. Intersectionality is an important component of disability inclusion. I'm going to talk about that today. But for the first time, maybe disability should be looked at first. You heard from Keith Sonderling, former EOC commissioner, that year after year, disability discrimination is the most common complaint after retaliation at the EOC. And yet I'll tell you one other stat. If you go on OFCCP by the numbers, and you look at OFCCP's enforcement recoveries, year after year, and you look at the tens of thousands of employees who have been helped by OFCCP or have been received remedies from OFCCP based on race and gender, you see those numbers. Then you go all the way down to the bottom, and you look at disability, and you see that it's 2 people in the entire country, 2 people for 2021 or 2022, whatever it is. One year it's 1 person, 1 year it's 5, 1 year it's 2. And you begin to ask yourself, well, what's going on here? 503 is a statute. It's a statute, and yet OFCCP has only helped 2 people in the entire country. It's upsetting. And I'm not saying that, as HR professionals, and I'm management side, I'm an attorney, I also want to avoid remedies, for my clients, but when you look at it systemically and you see that OFCCP has devoted 99% of its resources to race and gender discrimination, but less than 1% to disability, it causes you to question that. Like, what's going on there? I'll go so far to submit to you, and maybe this sounds more like me speaking as the former OFCCP director than as a K&L Gates partner, but I'll go so far to say that OFCCP's enforcement of pay equity and non-discrimination in hiring through their statistical reviews, through their broad-based audits, through the self-auditing process that each of you do at your own companies to look for adverse impact, pay equity self-audits, to look at systemic compensation and hiring discrimination based on race and gender, has done as much as any federal agency or state agency in the country to help eliminate that. To help eliminate that. Because every year now, there's professionals like you, the conscience of your companies, that are looking at that issue. Because you know that if OFCCP comes and audits, well, first, because you know it's important and you care about it. But second, you also know, and this is how you also can convince your C-suite, your leadership, to put resources into this. You know that if OFCCP comes, they're going to run these statistical analyses. They're going to identify disparities based on race and gender, and they're going to want to know why you have those disparities. Can you explain them? If you can't explain them based on neutral, non-discriminatory, legitimate reasons, then why aren't you doing something about it? And they may even require you to do something about it. You know this. That's made such an impact to eliminate sex and race discrimination in employment. It's made such an impact on ensuring that there's not pay gaps, or at least trying to eliminate those pay gaps based on race and gender. And yet none of that happens in the disability area, at least on a systemic basis, because OFCCP doesn't focus on that area as much as it should. So anyhow, I'm glad to be here today to speak about this topic. Because, and I'm hopeful OFCCP, if they're listening, that they do more in this area. Because I'll tell you, this was one of the most popular initiatives when I was OFCCP director among the OFCCP compliance officers, investigators, among the most of the 500 or so people that made up OFCCP across the country. This is a very popular initiative. And a lot of people at OFCCP have disabilities. Just like a lot of people in this country have disabilities. Over a quarter of the American population, that's the statistic that's usually used, about a quarter of the population have a disability. That number is really low compared to the amount of people that actually have a disability. Because when you look at the broad definition of disability that's included in the self-identification form, or that's included when you look at the ADA definition, or the Section 503 definition of disability, which is a physical or mental impairment that impacts a life function, a major life function. And then you look at all the different aspects or a major life system, all of those functions or systems, which is basically all aspects of life, from the way you think, to the way you eat, to the way you sleep, to the way you speak, to the way you interact, to the way you think. Disability is quite broad. We heard when we were talking about different generations, we heard Keith speaking, and when he was doing the podcast up here, we heard him talk about how with Gen Z you see a lot of mental health disabilities being brought up: anxiety, depression, ADHD, autism, a lot of the disabilities that are considered to be neurodivergent. And when you think about that, how many people have depression or anxiety, ADHD, autism, a learning disability, dyslexia, dyspraxia? When you think about that, we're talking about well over half the country. Well over half the country. And at some point in our lives, all of us will have a permanent or temporary disability, almost by definition, how they define the term disability. So this is a big group. So a lot of people at OFCCP would come up to me and tell me, I'm glad we're focused on disability. I feel like we need to focus more on this. I have a disability, Craig. You know, they had obviously under no obligation to tell me that. It's confidential, but they would tell me. And in fact, we did a whole focus at OFCCP on disability inclusion. We did training on accommodations. I did a presentation with the head of our Civil Rights Center at the Department of Labor that we sent to every OFCCP employee, but we also posted on our website saying that we welcome disability at OFCCP. We know many of you have disabilities. We want you to feel comfortable with your disabilities. We celebrate your disabilities. We want you to be as productive as possible. We want you to feel like you belong in our agency. If you seek an accommodation, it should be granted as a matter of course. I understand there's all these federal regulations. It's a very legalistic process. Let's make it as unlegalistic as possible. If you make that request, we're going to do our best to grant it. And I told and I got this approved by legal even, I believe it or not. But I told them, before you deny an accommodation, you need to check with the Civil Rights Center. And you need to elevate it to a higher level person at OFCCP. And I had a designee who was my deputy, OFCCP National Deputy Director. And she knew very well that I wanted to grant these, and she did. And so we had a very inclusive environment. And one of the reasons are they do this morale study every year called the FEVS. And our morale ratings went way up through the roof when I was there. We had a big increase. It was notable, but this was a big reason because people knew, I'd say there are two parts to that. One, they knew that we would grant the accommodations. And two, during COVID, I was right at the beginning. We were one of the first agencies to let people work from home when that started. And then I gave a speech to the agency and I said, many of you are caregivers. You're going to have your children at home with you. That's fine. For a long time, that was not allowed. But practically, how would that work? And I said, that's fine. And I told supervisors, be flexible with the workforce. But I didn't just tell the supervisors, I told the whole agency. So all of the people that would be requesting these accommodations heard me, the director, tell their supervisor they should be granting these. And it worked, and a lot of the supervisors were very happy to grant them. So anyhow, I spoke a lot in my introductory slide. They let me put these nouns, adjectives about myself. Attorney, advocate, caregiver, educator, former public administrator. I noticed I put it last, and really attorney probably should be second to last. I care deeply about disability inclusion. I've been an advocate for many years. Since I was in middle school, I used to be, I used to work a lot with students with Down syndrome in middle school, and I was a Special Olympics coach. And I got very interested in disability inclusion in middle school and high school. I myself had OCD as a kid, ADHD, and at the time I didn't really view that as a disability, although it is, but I just didn't think of it that way. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily view it as a disability because for a long time in this country, disability has been stigmatized. And they're like, well, I can do everything. I don't need an accommodation, so I don't necessarily view this as a disability. And yet it is. And there's nothing bad about that. In fact, because it's a disability, you can get supports and accommodations. So, I did that through college, through law school, and then I had a daughter, Alexandra, who had profound autism and intellectual disability. And that's impacted our whole lives. And she's my best friend, and I adore her. And I wouldn't change her. I want her to be able to be as independent as possible. And I want her to have all the supports, and I want her to be happy, but I never want her to think for a moment I would want her to be different. Because that's how she is. That's who she is. That's her life. And she has a lot to add. She has a lot to add. So I became an advocate for her, in particular, through her IEP process. For special education, the plans that are put together that are individualized for students to help them have the supports they need. Then we had our son Pierce. Pierce also diagnosed on the spectrum and with OCD. Different part of the spectrum than Alex. We got that diagnosis very early. He got a lot of supports. He's in a typical class today. Probably see me post about them both a lot on LinkedIn. By the way, Link to me on LinkedIn, and then I post about them a lot. So I advocated for them. And then I began thinking to myself, I'm doing all this advocacy. I'm an attorney and the OFCCP director. My wife is a psychiatrist. Like, we're well situated to do this advocacy, and yet it's still so hard and complex and anxiety-ridden and a struggle. And I thought about, my goodness, what about people who are not lawyers, who love their kids just as much, who want to see them do well? And think about all the disparate impacts that probably come in when you have to file a lawsuit or bring a due process complaint or, struggle and fight with the establishment, wherever that establishment may be, and how often maybe you're denied these things. So I became an advocate, caregiver, obviously, and an educator. I teach disability rights law at GW Law. So first, let's talk about neurodiversity. What a great term. I remember the first time I learned that term, I was in Gables. We had just done the principles of inclusion there, which I recommend looking up on Google or on a web browser. Neurodiversity, pardon me, Coral Gables, Principles of Inclusion. We started that in the Gables because Coral Gables, if any of you have ever been there, city in South Florida, just west of Miami, planned city, gorgeous city, tree canopy, old Spanish architecture, really focused on the resident experience. It's a great place to live. It is a bit like a homeowners association for an entire city, and they do control your paint colors, and there's a lot of code enforcement violations, which I used to be the city prosecutor too. I was very lenient, like my name, Leen. I was very lenient, and I would work them out with people, because we were just trying to get compliance. But and a lot of stories about that another time. But, one thing I always like to say is you could meet with the manager, the mayor, all the commissioners, the city attorney, city clerk, all in one day. And yet, they didn't really have a disability inclusion program at all. And my daughter, I wanted her to have swim lessons at the Venetian Pool, which is a gorgeous swimming pool. Look at Venetian Pool. The largest public swimming pool in the United States, I believe, and the prettiest too, although I'm biased. But it's a beautiful pool. I wanted her to swim. She loved the Venetian pool. But my daughter also, as many autistic kids are, was attracted to water and needed to know how to swim for her own safety. So I wanted her to get swim lessons. So I go to the pool. They take a look at my daughter. She doesn't interact with them. She looks away, and they understand that she has autism, and they tell me no. This was before I was city attorney. They told me no. And I said, why? And they're like, well, because we're not equipped to have someone in the pool with her, and we won't allow a parent to be in the pool. I said, I'm willing to take any background check or anything you need, because I knew that was probably the reason they didn't let the parents in the pool. And they're like, nope, we can't accommodate her. You have to go to the county. And I'm like, I don't even know where the county, Miami-Dade County is a huge county. I'm like, I don't know where to go. This is Coral Gables. You're telling me I have to leave my city, the city that does everything for its residents? It was upsetting. So when I became city attorney, that always stuck with me. And then it happened again at the youth center. They have this youth center for kids. Beautiful, wonderful youth center, like a YMCA or a Boys and Girls Club, but for the city, run by the city, with wonderful resources and facilities and programs. And because I was city attorney, I got a free membership. So I could bring my daughter or bring my child, and they had like a kids club there. And I was going to go work out. So I brought her. And they called me. I had to leave my workout because they said they couldn't accommodate her. It was too much. They couldn't do a one-on-one. Now I am the city attorney. And by the way, they didn't treat me any better than anyone else. They treated me the same. And, or if they did, then they really weren't treating people right in that regard, in that one time. So so they told me this, and I was like, this is crazy. I'm like the city attorney. Like, I need to change this. So I talked to the commissioners. And I found a commissioner who was willing to sponsor this, and they let me actually be a sponsor, even as the attorney. They let me be a proponent of this, an actual proponent. I said, I want to make us the most disability inclusive city in the country. And we put together these principles of inclusion. We empowered directors. We put a budget. We did all of these programs. My daughter got to do so much there. She got to swim in the pool. She got to do autism and golf, autism and, there's so many different autism-related programs and inclusion programs they did. They partnered with Crystal Academy, which was a school for kids with autism. They did Mayor for a Day. My daughter got to be Commissioner for a Day. They did so many things. And that was a big part. They covered a lot of autism-related benefits in their programs. And I was a part of all that. And then I would go from city to city. I went to Miami-Dade County to a lot of the cities to get this included. So through that, I became a disability advocate. I became known for my work in the disability field. And I got the call when Alex Acosta became Secretary of Labor. He knew of my work in this area, and that's why I became OFCCP Director, because I've been working in this area now and been an advocate for a number of years. I had done work in the civil rights area generally as a lawyer. I've been the head of the civil rights section, federal litigation section at Miami-Dade County as an attorney. And at K&L Gables, we had our own civil rights issues, and I had been very active in working to improve civil rights in the Gables, and I worked with our minority communities in the Gables, disability community in the Gables. So I had experience in the area, but it was because of the principles of inclusion and my work on disability inclusion that I got the appointment. And so when I got to OFCCP, I'll tell you, when I started looking at it, I was so pleased that they had Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act. But when I started learning that we really didn't, and we had good regulations, and they had self-identification, and I give credit to my predecessor, Pat Shue, for putting those regulations in place. I was so excited about it, but then I started to realize in our audits, we spent literally less than 1% of the audit on this topic. We didn't ask for the information. We didn't audit hiring or pay based on disability. We had a 7% utilization goal. No company ever met it. They were always at 2 or 3%. I understand it's a goal, but we didn't do much with that. We didn't put together plans or ways for them to reach it. We basically perfunctorily reviewed some of what they were doing to try to achieve that, and then just close the audit. So, and then we had no concept of neurodiversity at all, or non-apparent disabilities. Almost everything was focused on apparent disabilities, and we had a self-identification document that used offensive terminology about intellectual disability, which I'm sure you know what that is. So I was like, what is this is, by the way, I have great respect for OFCCP. I love the agency, but I was extremely disappointed. And there was just not expertise on this area. It was not a focus, you could tell. So first thing I did is we're changing this form. I'm not ever talking about this form. So like they would always bring it, I'm like, the form has that term, I don't even want to see it. I want to see the form. I feel sorry for our contractors that they're required to give this form to people when it has such an offensive term on it. We need to fix that. So we did. We fixed it right away. We added more disabilities to the form. I started having OFCCP work with the Office of Disability Employment Policy. It was a big focus of my time, as you all know, if you're in this field. One thing I wanted to do was have a neurodiversity in the workplace program, and I want to start advocating for that. So we did best practices. We put that in there. So today, in your own organizations, I hope you include neurodiversity and disability in your DEI programs, in your affirmative action programs. I know you have to have a Section 503 affirmative action program, and I've seen OutSolve Section 503 affirmative action programs that they work on with many of you, and they're great. It's wonderful that you have them. It's important, but please include neurodiversity and non-apparent disability in your AAP programs. Please do that. I'll tell you, I often ask, well, what happens if, and I'm not here to predict this election, but what happens if the Republicans come back? I'll tell you, one thing that they will focus on in Republican administrations is disability, religion, and veterans. Those tend to be the triumvirate of areas that Republican administrations tend to prioritize. And Democratic administrations obviously support all those areas too. So, if you're trying to prepare for a potential Republican administration, I would focus on disability. I would include disability. I know if I were ever OFCCP director again, I would focus on that. And if I'm advising a future OFCCP director, that's what I'm going to tell them to do. So Neurodiversity. What is neurodiversity? I included a couple definitions from EARN, which is the resource provided by the Office of Disability Employment Policy. Neurodiversity is defined as the variation and difference in neurological structure and function that exist among human beings. Neurodiversity refers to the variation in neurocognitive functioning. It's an umbrella that encompasses neurocognitive differences. And look at all these disabilities, conditions: autism, ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette's syndrome, anxiety, OCD, depression, intellectual disability, and schizophrenia, as well as normal neurocognitive functioning or neurotypicality, and normal in quotes. So we all know to be careful about the use of the term normal. EARN, and that's they're citing the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network there, and the first one was citing dictionary.com. But these are on ODEP's website, so you could definitely use these definitions. What do I see there when I look at that? And look, there's two ways to look at neurodiversity. One is through the social model of disability, the idea that we all are unique neurologically, that there's a spectrum, like in any area, that you have some people that might be considered outliers, which is not a great term, but statistically, outliers. They think differently. They may have one of these disabilities that makes them one of the 2 to 5% that would be considered an outlier. At the same time, I would tell you, when you consider all the neurodivergent disabilities, it's well over 2%. It's probably more like 20% of the public would be considered neurodivergent, so it's not really outliers, it's a lot of us. And even some of us who might not be considered neurodivergent certainly may think uniquely in different areas, and as a principle of universal design, a lot of the supports for neurodivergence may help all your employees. So, keep that in mind. But neurodiversity, when I see that from the social model of disability, it's the idea that we want to include as many people as possible, including people who think differently. We don't want to stigmatize that. We don't want to call people names. We want people to feel included. We don't want to call people crazy or strange or peculiar. We want people to feel comfortable in their skin, who they are, with their mind, and feel like they can contribute and they won't be insulted or treated differently, and then in fact their different thinking will be embraced. That's what you want. So that's what I think from the social model. From more of the medical model or simply the legal model of disability, I see a lot of medical conditions there, and I begin to think, you know what? Probably most of your organizations already meet the 7% self-ID goal. Well, it's not self-ID, 7% disability utilization goal. They just haven't self-identified. Because in society, it's probably 40, 50% of the public could self-ID if they wish. I started self-IDing. I hadn't self-ID'd before. It's a very personal thing. I just hadn't thought of it. But when I became OFCCP Director, and initially I didn't even self-ID because of neurodivergence, although now I would self-ID as neurodivergent. I was looking at OFCCP's list and I saw migraines. I've had chronic migraines my whole life. My mom had really significant migraines, had to go to the hospital a number of times. I've gone a couple times in my life. And I've largely been able to manage them, although I do still get visual distortion from time to time. And I need to take some medicine to make sure I don't get the very severe pain that sometimes accompanies that. And, I can manage it. Now they might just be an hour or two. It used to be, it could be half the day. But the point is, when I saw migraines on there, I was like, I have migraines. Why am I not self-IDing? It was on the list. And migraines is interesting because it's an area where a lot of people don't realize that migraines are a disability. And a lot of times they think of them as bad headaches or headaches. But they're not. It is a disability, and it is something that's recurring for people, and they can be debilitating. They can impact your ability to work. And it's also another area where being able to get an accommodation can make you be perfectly successful in the workplace if you get that accommodation. I had just been giving myself those accommodations my whole career because I had always been in a top-level position after the first 4 or 5 years of starting in the workforce. So, I had been city attorney, OFCCP director, chief of federal litigation. I didn't really have a supervisor. So I could just give myself these accommodations. I could go home, I could take a break. But when I started talking to people at OFCCP and among federal contractors and employees, I started hearing like, oh, I have migraines too, and it's a struggle for me. I have to decide whether to take sick leave. Do I seek the accommodation? Just having 30 minutes to go somewhere and take a nap would be helpful. But if I sleep at work, they're going to fire me unless I disclose my disability. And, you know, should I disclose it? Is it a disability? So I started self-IDing. But the point is that if you have a neurodiversity in the workplace program, you're much more likely to get a higher self-ID rate. If you have a chief accessibility officer who's leading the neurodiversity in the workplace program. I often like to mention Jenny Leigh Fleury from Microsoft, who is sort of the first major chief accessibility officer in the United States, and a mentor to me, and someone that I visited Microsoft's autism hiring program when I was OFCCP Director. But boy, does Microsoft focus on disability, and you know, that leads to higher self-ID rates. And having a chief accessibility officer who does that and who focuses on these issues and makes people feel comfortable knowing that if they self-ID as being neurodivergent or having a disability, that it's not going to hurt them at all. In fact, it may help them because it may lead to a conversation where they get an accommodation, or it may lead to the company realizing, hey, we have a lot of people with neurodivergent disabilities. Let's create an affinity group or ERG for neurodiversity. Let's create a caregiver ERG. Let's create a disability ERG and put more resources into that. That is why including neurodiversity can be very helpful. So another term, so one term I want to talk about was neurodiversity. We talked about it. We can talk about it more in a little bit. Accessibility, another term I think is really important. And there's another slide later which says that only 4% of DEI programs, diversity, equity, inclusion programs in the United States include disability. Only 4%. This is from the Harvard Business Review, a study that was reported in the Harvard Business Review. I remember seeing that, and it reminded me, it brought me back to when I started OFCCP, and I saw those stats which showed that they didn't include disability in their enforcement program. That may be an overgeneralization. If anyone's here from OFCCP, I understand, but that's the way I felt. It's just truth. That's the way I felt. Like, why do we never talk about disability? Why are there no stats showing what we're doing to help people with disabilities? And that's what was the genesis of the Focus Review program. But, you know, so that's true for federal agencies too. I remember when when I was up for OPM Inspector General, I was nominated by President Trump, and I went through my Senate confirmation hearing, and I put together a platform of what I would do as Inspector General. And a lot of it was focused on civil rights in the federal workforce, because it was for the Office of Personnel Management, which is the human resources department for the whole federal government, for the 3 million workers in the federal government. So I put together this proposal, this plan. One of the things I wanted was for every federal agency to have a neurodiversity in the workplace program. And so I started looking into it. I could not find one that did. And if there is one, tell me. But I could not find one that did. And of course, I had been advising at OFCCP as director for 3 years, have a neurodiversity in the workplace program. And yet, boy, we were being hypocritical as the federal government. You know, the federal government is often hypocritical. They were on prior pay for a long time. When I was picked as OFCCP director and they were going to set my pay, they asked me for my last 5 years of pay. The federal government, I remember them asking me, and I'm like, you're not supposed to ask. They're like, it's required. It's a regulation. I'm like, okay, that's great. Do you know what I'm applying to be the OFCCP director? We tell them not to do that. Whatever, you got to do it. Well, I wanted to get paid, so I gave them the 5 years. And they didn't pay me that well, to be honest. But the point is, it didn't help. Didn't help, even though I had more. Didn't help. So the point is, but they asked. And so I used to use that story all the time. We're such hypocrites. We're here telling you this, but we do it ourselves. But yet, we still need to tell you, don't do it. Finally, President Biden, through executive order and some regulations, has now stopped the federal government from asking for your prior pay. So at least they're no longer hypocritical on that point. But on neurodiversity in the workplace, they have been. So this is something that is countrywide. Our governments, and at the local and state level too, because when I was city attorney and did the principles of inclusion on autism and intellectual disability and other disabilities, same thing. No cities really had that. So it's endemic to the country. It's something that we need to fix. But really, we should start with you. The private sector is in the lead here on neurodiversity in the workplace programs, on accessibility in the workplace programs. And yet, as I mentioned, still only 4% of DEI programs in the United States include disability. And most of them are just DEI. They don't include the A for accessibility. I give a lot of credit to President Biden there too. When he issued his DEIA executive order, he included accessibility, included a significant focus on accessibility and disability inclusion. And take a look at that DEIA executive order. I know that DEIA has become controversial to an extent, has become a political issue to an extent, but take a look at the DEIA executive order and look in particular at that accessibility section. It really is a great example of what you could do, what you can do, what the federal government is supposed to be doing to include accessibility day to day. Here's the definition that's used. The term accessibility means the design, construction, development, and maintenance of facilities, information, communication technology, programs, services, so all people, including people with disabilities, can fully and independently use them. Accessibility includes the provision of accommodations and modifications to ensure equal access to employment and participation in activities for people with disabilities, reduction or elimination of physical and attitudinal barriers to equitable opportunities, commitment to ensuring that people with disabilities can independently access every outward-facing and internal activity or electronic space, and the pursuit of best practices such as universal design. That's a great definition. It's a little long, but it's a great definition. It's a great definition because it talks about the technical, which you do need to have technical accessibility. You do need to have website accessibility, accessibility of spaces, physical and digital spaces, but also it's an attitude. It's an attitude of wanting to make sure everyone feels included and considering that as part of your approach to your business. So like at Gables, which now has a chief accessibility officer, any policy that's going to be pursued by that city when they're doing the signatures, you know how, and you have this at your organizations too, a lot of people have to sign off on new things. Chief accessibility officer signs off. So they have a CAO or someone considering disability and accessibility signing off on every policy or practice. And that leads to you avoiding big mistakes where you roll out a policy that is not inclusive, that doesn't have website accessibility, that's not Section 5, and you're the federal government, Section 508 compliant. Like it's a document that no one can access, that screen reader can't read, that doesn't have captioning. You know, if you have your CAO looking at every policy and practice you do and signing off on it, those things just won't happen because that's the person's job. So I highly recommend that. Intersectionality. This is a big one. And I have to tell you, I'm surprised, at least at OFCCP. I'm not here to criticize OFCCP, but I'm surprised they haven't done more with this in this administration. When I was OFCCP Director in the Trump administration, I focused on intersectionality. Because one thing I saw when I was looking at the statistical reviews we did was that we looked at race and we looked at gender, and we didn't look at anything else. We never combined race and gender, and we didn't combine anything else with race and gender. And it didn't make any sense to me. Because when I was getting into this field, I asked for the pay gap information, and we work with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so they'll give you the pay gap information. And right away, I was like, well, what's the biggest pay gap? And they're like, pay gap for women of color. The Latina pay gap is close to 50%. So is the pay gap for black women and for indigenous women. They're the largest pay gaps that are really recorded. And of course, if you add disability, that intersection, or other protected classes, LGBTQ+, it can get even bigger. Get even bigger. And yeah, then people would say, yeah, but that's not an adjusted pay gap. It doesn't control for the job. Well, first of all, I don't know if I buy that completely, because it does include the fact that in this country we have glass ceilings, and that a lot of the big paying jobs that lead to the pay gap are not filled proportionally by women and minorities. So, you know, that's an issue for OFCCP as an affirmative action agency, trying to get a more diverse workforce into the higher level jobs to break glass ceilings. But putting that aside, just from a statistical standpoint, even if you control for job, what we were finding at OFCCP was you still had about an average 5 to 9% pay gap. And a lot of you have that opportunity with OutSolve. They'll do an adjusted pay gap analysis for you. I've looked at them, and a lot of you have 4 or 5% pay gaps based on race or gender. Sometimes it's a little less. Sometimes it can be 3 or 2, but it's usually not 0 or 1. It's usually at least 2, and sometimes a little bit more. Which tells me, if I were the federal regulator, if I look at your entire workforce and know you have an average pay gap of 2% adjusted, you're probably going to have a couple job groups or EO1 job categories where it's more. where it's going to be 4 or 5. You're going to probably have some others where it's 0 or even goes the other way. Might favor men, for example. But, pardon me, might favor women. But if you have an average pay gap against women of 2%, you're going to have some job groups which are going to probably be statistically significant. So, you know, anyway, so I mention all this because I'm talking about intersectionality. I didn't understand why OFCCP didn't have regulations saying you should look at race and gender together for hiring and also for pay. And I remember there was I was looking at a security firm, a security company once, a security contractor. I was an OFCCP compliance officer for a day. I remember I went to the Arlington office. We were looking at a security contractor of some sort, and it was very clear in their hiring that they were favoring white women and disfavoring black men. And it was probably based on some sort of stereotype. This particular company, the type of security they provided. And I asked about it. I go, well, look, if we look at just gender, we don't really get statistical significance. If we look at just race, we don't really get statistical significance. But I bet you if you look at them together, we would. Because it's pretty clear what they're doing here, just looking at the ratios. They probably have a stereotype or an idea of who they want to hire, an archetype in their head, which is really a stereotype of a race and gender that they think would be best at this. And that is prejudice. That's the definition of it. It's wrong. We should be detecting that, if that's true. We should ask them about it at least, but you know, why aren't we looking at that statistically? And I never got a good answer. And so I put some FAQs in place at the time saying we're going to start looking at intersectionality. We're going to combine race and gender, look at the pay gaps, because how are we going to otherwise address the pay gap? If you have a 7% pay gap for black women at a company and a 4% for women and a 2% for minorities, you're not going to address the 7% gap if you just address the 4 and 2. And in fact, because you may end up not having statistical significance for one of them, you might not address half of the problem, half of the issue, and that harms black women. So we need to do something about that. And they did put some FAQs in place, and then we were working to try to have them start including that in the audits and publishing guidance. And I thought that in this administration, because there has been a focus on intersectionality, to this administration's credit, I thought OFCCP would start doing all of their audits looking at race and gender together, similar to the New York artificial intelligence law, where when you're looking at adverse impact, you're combining race and gender when you look at that to see if there's disparities. And frankly, I thought the EOC would start doing that in their adverse impact analyses as well, start combining race and gender, because all of you from a compliance perspective, you're gonna, I mean, you may agree with everything I'm saying about intersectionality, but at the same time, you're going to do what they tell you because you want to be compliant. So if they tell you look at race and gender separately, that's what you're going to do. If they only bring cases based on race and gender separately, that's what you're going to focus on. And you know what? You're going to address a lot of the problem, and and that's good, and you're following what the agencies tell you, but the agencies need to get, it's 2024. They need to start looking at intersectionality because they're not doing their job otherwise. Because they're not fully addressing the pay gaps and hiring gaps that exist in this country, this extraordinarily diverse country. And they need to do that. They need to do that. I mean, one issue I often heard at OFCCP was if you look at high-level executive positions, you still see predominantly white males in those positions. Well, OFCCP doesn't see that because they don't look at race and gender together. So, what is intersectionality? According to Merriam-Webster, intersectionality is the complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. It's a concept developed by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a professor at my alma mater at Columbia University. It involves recognition that each of us has multiple intersecting or overlapping identities. There's a positive component to this. I've talked about the enforcement component of it. There's a very positive component to intersectionality too, related to self-identification, that we are multiple identities, that it's reductionist to say you're only your race, or you're only your gender, or you're only your disability, you're only your LGBTQ plus status, you're only your veteran status. No, you're a combination. All of us are complex individuals with multiple identities. I used to, when I would give speeches at OFCCP, I would say, look, you know what? I'm a white male, Catholic, disabled, person. My national origin is the United States. And you know what? On every one of those grounds, I'm protected. So don't think that the executive order doesn't protect white men. It does. It does. If you're discriminating as an entity against white men, and let me just say, that is not that common. But if you are, that's illegal. OFCCP, if they find that in the stats, they're going to do something about it. I'm protected by the executive order as much as any of you. And a lot of times people don't realize that. But if you look at OFCCP's enforcement statistics, 25% of their enforcement recoveries go to employees who are white or who are male as a protected class, 25%. So and this is across administrations, the Biden administration and the Trump administration. It hasn't changed. So they are focusing on all protected classes. But the point is, intersectionality comes into play there. We're all multiple identities, and we should talk about intersectionality. I often talk about it in the disability area because it's well known that if you are white or you're a male in the disability area, you're probably going to have better access to accommodations, to supports, and a lot of times it may not even be based on your race per se, hopefully not, because that's disparate treatment, but because of disparate impact, because of correlations between race and access, correlations between race and generational wealth, salary, because of the pay gaps and things like that, which give you more of an ability to be able to get accommodations and supports. Let me give you an example. I'm on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, the D.C. Advisory Committee. I'm the vice chair. For the past several years, and I was the sponsor of this topic, we've been looking at the District of Columbia. We've been looking at the provision of special education services, both substantively in terms of education and programs, and also transportation, related services for special education in the District of Columbia, in the public schools. And in particular, we've been looking at, DC has the highest rate, historically, of due process complaints brought by parents to challenge if they haven't been given what they've requested or what they need in an IEP, in an individualized educational program for their student, which is something that you negotiate with the school system. You're all supposed to be a team. You put together these IEPs. But DC has the highest rate of due process complaints filed and lawsuits. And I had a personal experience where my daughter was at a school where she was not getting the support she needed. They just did not have the staff or resources. She needed substantial support. I asked that she be transferred to a more appropriate school, St. Coletta, where she goes now. And I was told, to achieve that, you have to sue the school district. By the school district. That's what they told me, their representative at the school. They said, what you do is you file a lawsuit, and then you settle. And then your child can go to one of these schools. They told me that. I remember hearing that. I'm like, well, what if I don't want to sue the school district? Why can't you give it because it's appropriate? That's the way it works. That's what I was told. And I just remember that sitting with me. We fortunately were able to get her in through a lottery and through advocacy. So we were able to get her in without having to file a due process complaint or a lawsuit. But that always stuck with me. So when I got on this committee, I raised the issue. I said, hey, I had this experience, and now I'm looking at the studies, and it shows that DC has the highest, not only has the highest rate of due process complaints and lawsuits, probably because they're inviting them to an extent, but in addition to that, they have the highest rates of settlements without a hearing. So it actually sounds like my personal experience, that anecdote is their practice to some extent. Can we look into this issue? Because that's going to have a huge disparate impact based on race. A huge disparate impact. Because in DC, which is a majority minority city, or close to it, it's about that, there is different wards of the city have different socioeconomic levels, and the areas that are predominantly white have a higher socioeconomic level in terms of income and wealth, and probably what you're going to see is that those groups are filing the lawsuits because they have the money, and many of them are attorneys because they're in DC. So they're going to be filing the lawsuits and due process complaints. They're the ones that probably DC's paying for their kids to go to these great schools. It can be up to $70,000 a year. And probably the minority communities in DC, which do not have access to attorneys to the same extent, they're probably not getting that. I bet you're going to see a huge disparate impact. And we just yesterday, after a couple of years of study, issued our findings or approved our findings in a public meeting. And yes, we found a lot of that to be the case. And it's going to be I'm very proud of this report. I think it's going to make a big impact in DC and also across the country. But the point is, that's intersectionality in action. Because what's happening is everyone with a disability should be able to get an IEP, get a special education program, but what we're seeing is often disparate impacts based on the combination of disability and race, disability and national origin, disability and immigration status. That's impacting these numbers significantly. So you should be considering that in your own workplaces, because it's not just true in education, it's true in the workplace as well. I have 5 minutes. Add the A to DEI. Only about 4% of DEI programs include disability. I've mentioned this. I just want to remind you. Consider adding it. Have a chief accessibility officer. I've talked about all these, but here are some of the statutes that impact disability in the workforce. And here's a number of best practices. You'll have my slides. OFCC, a lot of these are taken from OFCCP's website because I helped contribute to those best practices when I was there. All of these will help you be compliant with Section 503 and being disability inclusive workplace. And probably the biggest one is having your CEO be involved. Have your CEO sign the disability letter, disability inclusion letter. Have a disability inclusion work ERG, or we have a disability inclusion task force at my firm I'm a co-founder of. I'm the co-chair of it. Thank you, everybody.